Before we begin, understand this is not a story meant to entertain casually. It is a story meant to be remembered. If you value history told without simplification, consider subscribing and staying with us through the end. The Mediterranean sun of 69 BCE did not simply rise over stone and sea. It rose over Alexandria, a city that believed itself to be the center of human knowledge, a place where the mind of the ancient world gathered and argued and recorded itself on papyrus, where the salt of the harbor mixed with the scent of ink and old scrolls drifting out from the great library, and the thick incense of the royal palace burned constantly as if attempting to sanctify power itself. Alexandria was not an Egyptian city in the way Memphis or Thebes had once been. It was a Greek creation imposed upon Egyptian soil, founded by Alexander the Great as both a monument to conquest and a declaration that the future belonged to intellect as much as to armies. Philosophers debated beneath colonnades, while merchants unloaded spices and scholars mapped the heavens. And this was the city into which Cleopatra was born, not into peace, not into stability, but into a contradiction sharpened by ambition and fear. She was born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Macedonian Greek family that had ruled Egypt for nearly 2.5 centuries while never fully belonging to it. A ruling house that spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, and governed an ancient land whose people they ruled as foreigners. And over generations this distance had rotted into paranoia. The Ptolemies survived not through loyalty but through elimination. Brothers married sisters to keep bloodlines pure and then murdered them to remove rivals. Mothers poisoned sons, daughters plotted against fathers, and every reign ended either in exile or blood. The court itself functioned like a living weapon. Polished marble floors masking constant surveillance, where every servant might be an informant and every tutor a political asset. And to be born here was to be placed inside a golden cage where luxury was absolute and safety non-existent, where even childhood could be interpreted as threat. Cleopatra learned to walk beneath ceilings painted with gods, while knowing that divinity offered no protection at all. Her father, Ptolemy XII, Elitz embodied the decay of this dynasty, remembered not for conquest or wisdom, but for insecurity, mocked openly by Alexandrians as the flute player for his obsession with music rather than governance. A king who survived not through strength, but through bribery. Egypt under his reign was no longer a sovereign power. It was drowning in debt to Rome, forced to pay unimaginable sums merely to keep Roman legions from marching in openly. Roman diplomats wandered the palace halls with casual entitlement. Tax collectors spoke as if Egypt already belonged to them, and Cleopatra watched all of this from the shadows of marble balconies. A child witnessing something far more formative than lessons or ceremony. She saw her father bow without swords being drawn. She saw that humiliation could exist without conquest, that submission could be achieved through debt and fear alone. And in that moment, the illusion of divine kingship shattered. Cleopatra understood before most rulers ever did that crowns meant nothing without enforcement, that ritual could not stop empire, and that Egypt's survival would require something sharper than ancestry, something Rome itself respected. While her sisters Bernice and Arsinoe were trained in the surface rituals of court life, the fashion, the etiquette, the gossip whispered through eunuchs and minor officials. Cleopatra withdrew into the Mauseon, the house of the Muses, the intellectual heart of Alexandria and the living engine of its power. This was not merely a library, but an institution devoted to collecting the world itself. Scrolls arriving from across the Mediterranean to be copied, translated, archived. scholars arguing geometry and philosophy as if ideas themselves were weapons. And Cleopatra did not study as a curiosity, she trained, absorbing Euclid's mathematics to understand order and precision, studying astronomy to grasp cycles and inevitability, reading philosophy to understand how power justified itself. She learned that empires rose believing themselves permanent and fell believing the same lie. And more importantly, she mastered language deliberately and strategically. While previous Ptolemies had ruled Egypt without ever learning Egyptian, Cleopatra chose to speak it fluently, not as performance, but as control. She spoke to priests and officials in their own tongue, then learned Hebrew and Arabic and Syriac, the languages of merchants, diplomats, and border, preparing herself to negotiate not only with kings but with cultures. She was not becoming educated, she was becoming multilingual authority. This protected intellectual world shattered when she was still young. When Alexandria turned against her father's weakness and expelled him from the throne, and suddenly Cleopatra was forced to confront power without insulation. Ptolemy XII fled not to another kingdom but to Rome, the true ruler of the Mediterranean, and he took Cleopatra with him. Exile transforming childhood into exposure, Rome was nothing like Alexandria. It was louder, more violent, unfinished, and unapologetic. A city that smelled of sweat, iron, and ambition. Where power was seized, not inherited. Where senators debated virtue while selling influence. Where generals commanded loyalty through gold and fear rather than tradition. And Cleopatra watched this machinery operate openly. She watched men like Pompey and Julius Caesar move through the forum like forces of nature. Alliances forming beneath speeches, violence postponed rather than rejected. And she learned that Rome did not worship gods or history, it worshipped results. Kingship was despised not because Romans loved freedom, but because monarchy reminded them how easily power could belong to one will. And Cleopatra felt the Roman gaze upon her and her father, dismissive and amused, labeling them decadent Orientals clinging to a dying age. And she understood then that pity was more dangerous than hostility. When Rome restored her father to the throne in 55 BCE, it did so efficiently and brutally. Roman legions marching through Egypt not as allies but as enforcers, crushing resistance, executing rivals, and Cleopatra returned behind them, watching consequence unfold without ceremony. Her sister, Bernice, was executed publicly for daring to rule in their absence. Blood-staining palace, stone, and illusion dying completely. This was Cleopatra's true coming of age. The moment she understood that power was not cruel by accident, but cruel by design. That hesitation invited death, and that morality existed only when it served survival. By the time Ptolemy XII lay dying in 51 BCE, Cleopatra was no longer sheltered by books or exile. She was hardened by blood and reality, crowned at 18, yet bound by a final trap written into her father's will. Joint rule with her 10-year-old brother Ptolemy XIII. A fiction in a dynasty where shared power existed only briefly before betrayal. Cleopatra sensed advisors whispering and knives being sharpened, felt the palace tightening around her once again, the Nile preparing to rise, not with water but with family blood. And as she stepped toward the throne, she understood that her reign would not begin with peace, but with war. That survival would require intellect sharpened into weapon, and that the last Pharaoh of Egypt was about to enter history's most unforgiving game. Rome did not welcome Cleopatra the way Alexandria had raised her. It assaulted her senses immediately. The city was loud and compressed, and restless. Its streets narrow and filthy, its buildings stacked without harmony, its air thick with the smell of bodies, iron smoke, and ambition. And yet beneath this chaos pulsed authority of a kind Egypt no longer possessed. Rome was unfinished because it was still expanding, and Cleopatra, walking beside her exiled father, understood instinctively that this city did not preserve the past. It consumed the future. Ptolemy XII did not arrive as a king seeking alliance. He arrived as a debtor seeking survival. And Cleopatra watched him bow not before crowns, but before men who wore no symbols of divinity at all. Senators whose power came from wealth and networks. Generals whose loyalty was purchased with gold and promises. Rome presented itself as a republic of laws, but functioned as a marketplace where everything had a price. Influenced votes, legions, even justice. And Cleopatra absorbed this truth silently, learning that Rome did not conquer through ritual or culture. It conquered through contracts, corruption, and force disciplined enough to appear inevitable. In the Roman Forum, she watched the giants of the age move like living mechanisms of destiny. Pompey the Great passing with the confidence of a man who believed victory had become habit. Julius Caesar, still ascending, yet already unmistakable, calm, controlled, and terrifyingly patient. A man who listened more than he spoke and remembered everything. Cleopatra did not understand every debate, but she understood their purpose. Speeches were camouflage. Morality was theater. Real decisions were made elsewhere, in private houses, in whispered agreements, in debts that could only be repaid with blood. She saw senators denounce tyranny while plotting dictatorship, watched generals swear loyalty to the Republic while carving personal empires. And she learned that Rome feared monarchy not because it loved freedom, but because kingship exposed the truth that power concentrated naturally. Rome despised Eastern queens not for weakness but for visibility. A woman who ruled openly violated Roman mythology itself. Cleopatra was not merely foreign here, she was a threat by existence alone. Living in Rome stripped Cleopatra of any remaining illusions about lineage. Ancestry meant nothing without enforcement. Ideology bent instantly before necessity. And virtue was invoked only when it served ambition. She watched her father pour Egyptian gold into Roman hands and saw opinion shift overnight. Laws soften quietly. Legions suddenly appear willing to march. Corruption was not a flaw in Rome's system, it was the system. And Cleopatra understood that this flexibility was Rome's greatest strength. It allowed ambition to flourish while pretending stability. It allowed violence to be outsourced and justified. She also learned something far more dangerous. Rome respected intelligence when it was useful and destroyed it when it threatened control. Allies were temporary, loyalty transactional, and memory manipulated by those who survived to write it. When Rome finally decided to restore Ptolemy XII to the Egyptian throne in 55 BCE, it did so not out of loyalty but profit. Roman legions marched into Egypt efficiently and mercilessly. Resistance collapsed quickly beneath disciplined force. And Cleopatra returned behind them not as a child but as a witness. She saw how quickly populations bent when faced with organization rather than cruelty. How fear multiplied when order replaced chaos. And she saw the final cost of weakness when her sister, Bernice, was executed without hesitation for daring to rule in their absence. There was no trial worthy of memory, no prolonged drama, simply removal, blood on stone and silence afterward. And Cleopatra understood fully then that sentiment had no place in survival, that hesitation invited extinction, and that mercy was a luxury afforded only by those who already possessed power. By the time Cleopatra left Rome, she carried no affection for it. But she carried understanding. Rome believed it had hosted an exiled princess, a child learning the ways of a superior civilization. But in truth, Rome had revealed its anatomy to a future rival. Cleopatra returned to Egypt armed not with legions but with knowledge of how empire functioned, how fear was cultivated, how loyalty was purchased, how narratives were shaped to justify domination. And as her ship crossed the Mediterranean back toward Alexandria, she was no longer thinking like a daughter of the Ptolemies. She was thinking like a ruler preparing for inevitable confrontation, understanding that Rome would one day come for Egypt openly, and that when it did, she would need to meet it not as a relic of the past, but as an equal shaped by its own methods. When Cleopatra returned to Alexandria after Rome restored her father, the city felt familiar yet altered. The marble still shone, the harbor still pulsed with trade, but the illusion of safety was gone forever. She had seen too much to believe in stability. And as Ptolemy XII resumed his throne under Roman protection, Cleopatra watched him rule like a man already defeated, fearful of shadows, paranoid of dissent, obsessed with appeasing Rome at the expense of Egypt. The treasury drained to repay debts, temples neglected, the people restless. And Cleopatra understood that kingdoms do not collapse suddenly. They rot quietly from the inside. Her father trusted no one. Not priests, not generals, not even his own blood. And this atmosphere of suspicion became the final classroom of her education. She learned to listen without reacting, to observe without revealing intent, to speak only when words created advantage. Because in the Ptolemaic court silence could be armor. When Ptolemy XII finally died in 51 BCE, he left behind a poisoned inheritance, a kingdom exhausted by debt and dependence, and a will designed not to preserve peace but to outsource legitimacy to Rome. Cleopatra at 18 was named co-ruler with her 10-year-old brother Ptolemy XIII. A child king controlled entirely by men who understood power far better than he did. Pothinus, the eunuch treasurer, Achillas, the general, and Theodotus, the tutor. These men did not see Cleopatra as a partner, but as an obstacle. She was educated, experienced, and independent. Everything they feared and could not control. And within months, the palace turned hostile. Decrees were issued in the boy king's name, while Cleopatra's image disappeared from coins. Her authority erased quietly, not through open confrontation, but administrative suffocation. The Alexandrian court whispered that she was arrogant, foreign, and dangerous. The mob, easily manipulated, began to turn, and Cleopatra realized she was being isolated deliberately, not to defeat her publicly, but to remove her invisibly. She attempted to assert authority by ruling alone in practice, issuing orders without her brother's approval, placing her name first on documents, aligning herself with Egyptian priests and the native population, a calculated move that terrified her brother's advisors. Because Cleopatra was doing what no Ptolemy before her had done. She was becoming Egyptian in identity, not just title, and this made her dangerous. Riots erupted in Alexandria, fueled by famine and propaganda. And in 48 BCE, the decision was made for her, not debated, but executed swiftly. Cleopatra was declared an enemy of the state and forced to flee the city under threat of death. She left Alexandria not in ceremonial procession, but in secrecy, stripped of palace guards' wealth and visibility, crossing into the deserts of Syria and Palestine with only a small, loyal circle. And here the girl raised among scrolls transformed fully into a strategist. Exile did not break her, it clarified her. Because for the first time she ruled without illusion. The desert Cleopatra did what her enemies believed impossible. She raised an army, not of loyal Egyptians, but of mercenaries paid with the last of her resources and the promise of restoration. She negotiated with tribal leaders and commanders directly, using language and intelligence rather than fear. Assembling force while her brother's advisors grew complacent, believing exile equaled defeat. Cleopatra did not seek sympathy, she sought leverage. And as Egyptian forces loyal to Ptolemy, the 13th marched toward Pelusium to face her. The wider world shifted violently, because while Egypt fought a family war, Rome itself was tearing apart. Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great locked in civil war that would decide the fate of the Republic. And destiny moved faster than any plan Cleopatra could have designed. Pompey defeated fled to Egypt seeking refuge. A man once powerful enough to make kings kneel, now desperate for sanctuary. And Ptolemy, the 13th's advisors, made a fatal calculation. Believing Roman politics could be manipulated like Egyptian crowds. They murdered Pompey upon arrival and presented his severed head to Caesar as a gift. An act meant to secure favor, but revealing only incompetence. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria, he was not impressed by brutality without intelligence. He seized the royal palace and summoned both rulers to submit their dispute to his judgment. Cleopatra understood immediately that this moment eclipsed everything before it. Her brother's men controlled the palace and would kill her on sight, but refusing Caesar meant surrendering legitimacy entirely. She was facing extinction either way, unless she broke every expectation. And so Cleopatra chose audacity over caution, deciding that if power was controlled privately, then she would reach it privately, and that the greatest gamble of her life would be her only path back to the throne. Cleopatra did not approach Julius Caesar as a supplicant or a rebel. She approached him as a calculated disruption, understanding that men who command empires are drawn not to obedience, but to boldness. Under the cover of night, she entered Alexandria's harbor in a small boat with only Apollodorus, the Sicilian, for protection. No guards, no banners, no declarations, only precision. She allowed herself to be wrapped tightly in linen and bound like cargo, not because she needed disguise, but because symbolism mattered. She was presenting herself not as a queen arriving in ceremony, but as an enigma delivered directly into power's private chamber. Carried past Ptolemy, the 13th's guards who were trained to stop armies, not ideas. And when the bundle was unrolled inside Caesar's quarters, Cleopatra stood revealed. Young dust, covered and composed, a ruler who had gambled everything on intellect rather than force. Caesar had conquered Gaul, crushed rivals, crossed the Rubicon, and dismantled the Roman Republic with methodical brilliance. Yet Cleopatra was something he had not encountered before. Not a provincial monarch begging for favor, but a sovereign who spoke his language fluently. Not just Latin, but the language of strategy. She did not plead for mercy or complain of injustice. She explained Egypt as an asset Rome was mismanaging. She framed stability, not sentiment, as her objective. Spoke of order, trade, grain, and influence with clarity that surprised even a man who believed himself unsurprised by everything. Cleopatra understood Caesar's psychology instinctively. She knew he respected intelligence, ambition, and risk. And that night an alliance was formed that would redraw the Mediterranean world. When Ptolemy the 13th discovered what had happened, his response was uncontrolled and fatal. He erupted publicly, tearing his crown and inciting the Alexandrian population against Caesar. Transforming a political dispute into open rebellion, the city ignited. Mobs attacked Roman troops and the palace was besieged. Caesar, Cleopatra, and a small force were trapped for months inside the royal complex, while Alexandria burned around them. This was not a romantic interlude, but a crucible. Cleopatra learned war, not from theory, but from proximity, watching Caesar manage crisis with relentless discipline, burning the Egyptian fleet to prevent capture and inadvertently setting fire to sections of the Great Library. Centuries of knowledge turned to ash beneath the smoke of rebellion, a loss that symbolized the collision between preservation and conquest. And Cleopatra watched, understanding that survival often demanded irreversible sacrifice. Inside the siege, Cleopatra was not passive. She advised, negotiated, and observed. She saw how Caesar balanced fear and reward, how he punished decisively but never randomly, how he framed every action as necessity rather than cruelty. And she absorbed these lessons quickly, because she knew she would need them. When Caesar's reinforcements finally arrived in 47 BCE, the conflict ended violently. The Battle of the Nile crushed Ptolemy, the 13's forces, and the boy king himself, drowned attempting escape, dragged beneath the river by the weight of armor he had never learned to carry. And with his death, Cleopatra's first civil war ended not with reconciliation but erasure. Cleopatra was restored to the throne by Roman arms, but not Roman control. Caesar married her symbolically to her younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, to satisfy Egyptian custom while leaving no doubt who ruled in reality. And for months afterward, Caesar remained in Egypt not as conqueror but as guest and partner, traveling the Nile with Cleopatra in a floating palace of gold and cedar. A deliberate performance meant to reshape Caesar's own self-image. Cleopatra was not seducing him for pleasure, but educating him in kingship, showing him temples older than Rome, rituals older than Latin, power that did not need senatorial approval to exist. And when Caesar finally left Egypt, he departed, changed, no longer imagining himself merely first among equals, but something closer to sovereign destiny. And Cleopatra watched him go, knowing that she had not just reclaimed her throne. She had bound Egypt's fate to the most dangerous man in the Roman world, and that this alliance would not protect her forever, but would instead pull her directly into the heart of history's greatest storm. Cleopatra emerged from the Alexandrian War not simply restored, but transformed. Her throne now secured by Roman recognition, yet balanced delicately between independence and dependency. She understood that Caesar had not saved her out of affection, but strategy. Egypt was Rome's grain heart, and she was its key. And so Cleopatra moved quickly to consolidate power internally while reshaping her position externally. She eliminated rivals with quiet efficiency, aligning herself with priests, administrators, and military leaders, presenting stability to a population exhausted by famine and civil war. And when she gave birth to a son in 47 BCE, she understood instantly the scale of what she had created. Caesarion was not merely a child, he was leverage, the living fusion of Egypt and Rome, proof that her alliance with Caesar was not symbolic but biological. And Cleopatra intended to use that fact with absolute precision. Cleopatra named the boy Ptolemy XV, but ensured the world knew him as Caesarion. Little Caesar, a deliberate provocation disguised as affection. She presented herself not as Caesar's mistress, but as his counterpart, the mother of his heir by blood, if not law, and she ruled Egypt in this period with calculated calm, stabilizing the economy, restoring temples, reforming taxation, and asserting her image across the kingdom through coinage and ceremony. Where previous Ptolemies had ruled from distance, Cleopatra made herself visible as pharaoh, adopting Egyptian iconography and ritual fully, no longer performing rule as foreign inheritance, but as living embodiment. This was not romantic nationalism, but survival strategy. Because Cleopatra understood legitimacy in Egypt flowed from divine representation, and she intended to own it completely. When Caesar invited Cleopatra to Rome in 46 BCE, she accepted without hesitation, understanding the risk but recognizing the opportunity. She did not arrive as a provincial queen, but as a sovereign asserting presence at the empire's center. Her procession through Rome was deliberate spectacle, exotic and unapologetic, designed to disrupt Roman expectations and force recognition. Caesar installed her across the Tiber in his private gardens, where senators crossed reluctantly to observe the woman reshaping their world. Cleopatra did not soften herself for Roman comfort. She spoke as an equal, not a guest, and this unsettled Rome deeply. Because Roman society tolerated foreign wealth, but not foreign authority, and never a woman who wielded both openly. The scandal reached its peak when Caesar placed a gilded statue of Cleopatra inside the temple of Venus, aligning her symbolically with his divine lineage. To the Roman elite, this was not art but declaration. It suggested kingship, divinity, and dynasty, everything the Republic claimed to despise. And whispers of conspiracy multiplied rapidly. Cleopatra became the embodiment of Rome's fear of monarchy, blamed not for Caesar's ambition but for revealing it. And when Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March 44 BCE, Cleopatra understood immediately that protection had vanished. More dangerously, she learned that Caesarion had been excluded from the will. Octavian named heir instead, cold, ambitious, and patient. A man who would never tolerate a living rival to Caesar's legacy. Cleopatra did not wait to see how Rome would turn its violence outward. She fled with precision, returning to Egypt with her son and court before chaos consumed her. And once home, she acted decisively. Ptolemy XIV died suddenly shortly after, leaving Cleopatra sole ruler with Caesarion elevated as co-king. The last obstacle removed quietly and without explanation. And as Rome descended into civil war between Caesar's avengers, Cleopatra ruled alone again, stronger and more dangerous than ever. A queen with a Roman heir, a restored kingdom, and the knowledge that the next Roman who sought her alliance would not be seeking love but survival, and that Egypt would soon be forced to choose sides in a war that would decide the fate of the world. The Roman world fractured after Caesar's death. Power no longer concentrated but contested, and from the chaos emerged two men destined to reshape history. Octavian, calculating, disciplined, and cold, and Mark Antony, charismatic, impulsive, and born for command. When the empire was divided, Antony took the east, inheriting Rome's most unstable frontier and its richest potential ally, Egypt. And Cleopatra understood immediately that this was not coincidence, but inevitability. Antony needed gold, grain, and legitimacy, and she possessed all three. But unlike Caesar, he was not a strategist who ruled through restraint. He was a man of appetite, emotion, and spectacle, and Cleopatra adjusted her approach accordingly. When Antony summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus in 41 BCE to answer accusations of supporting Caesar's assassins, she did not arrive to defend herself. She arrived to redefine the encounter, sailing up the Kidnus River on a barge built for myth rather than war. Its sails purple, its oars silver moving to music, incense filling the air. Cleopatra reclining beneath a golden canopy, dressed as Aphrodite incarnate. Not seduction for vanity, but for control. because Antony admired grandeur and Greek culture. He dreamed of heroic legacy, not republican duty. And Cleopatra spoke directly to that dream, turning interrogation into invitation, accusation into alliance. And by nightfall, Antony was dining at her table, not judging her fate. This encounter marked the birth of a partnership unlike anything Rome had seen. The formation of the inimitable livers in Alexandria was mocked by Roman historians as decadence, but masked serious strategy. Beneath the feasts and performances, Cleopatra secured what she needed most: Antony's protection and the elimination of her final rival Arsinoe, executed on Roman soil at Cleopatra's request. And in return, Antony received what Rome could no longer supply easily: money, ships, and loyalty in the East. Unlike Caesar, Antony did not seek to dominate Cleopatra intellectually. He joined her ambitions fully, allowing himself to be reshaped by the world she offered. And together they ruled Egypt not as client and master, but as co-architects of an alternative empire. Even when Antony returned to Rome to marry Octavian's sister in a temporary political truce, his bond with Cleopatra never dissolved. Egypt remained his anchor, and Alexandria his true capital. Cleopatra ruled efficiently during his absences, strengthening her navy, stabilizing borders, and presenting herself as mother of future kings. When she bore Antony twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, she named them deliberately as cosmic symbols of power: sun and moon, rulers of complementary spheres. And Egypt became once more a center of ambition, not survival. As Octavian consolidated power in Rome, Antony drifted further east, distancing himself from Roman expectations and embracing Hellenistic kingship openly. And Cleopatra supported this shift fully, because she understood that Antony's survival depended on redefining legitimacy itself. Rome was no longer the only center of the world, or so they believed, and Egypt was no longer content to serve as grain storehouse for a republic that no longer existed. This alliance was not born of passion alone, but of mutual defiance. And together, Antony and Cleopatra began moving toward a confrontation that would not be decided by speeches or treaties, but by fleets and fate. Because Rome would tolerate many things, but never an alternative vision of empire rising beyond its control. By 37 BCE, the illusion of balance between Mark Antony and Octavian was dissolving. Rome's unity existed only in name, and Cleopatra recognized that delay now meant submission later. Antony's failed Parthian campaign had weakened his position in Roman eyes, but increased his dependence on Egypt. And Cleopatra used that moment with precision. When they met in Antioch, she did not offer sympathy, she offered terms, demanding the restoration of territories once controlled by the Ptolemies: Syria, Cyprus, Phoenicia, parts of Judea, and strategic trade routes. And Antony agreed, not out of weakness alone, but conviction. He was no longer content to be Rome's eastern general. He wanted to rule, and Cleopatra was willing to help him reshape the world. The expansion transformed Cleopatra into the most powerful woman alive. But power visible is power challenged, and in Rome, Octavian seized the opportunity, unleashing a campaign of propaganda that would define Cleopatra's image for centuries. Antony was portrayed not as traitor, but victim, bewitched, enslaved, unmanned by an Eastern queen who corrupted Roman virtue. Cleopatra was recast as sorceress rather than sovereign. Ambition reframed as seduction, intelligence reduced to manipulation. And this narrative found eager audience in a society already fearful of female authority and foreign power. In 34 BCE, Antony staged the ceremony that ended any chance of reconciliation. The donations of Alexandria were not merely political declaration, but symbolic revolution. In the great gymnasium, Antony and Cleopatra sat on golden thrones, elevated above the crowd, dressed as Osiris and Isis, presenting themselves as divine rulers rather than Roman officials. Antony proclaimed Cleopatra Queen of Kings and Caesarion King of Kings, publicly recognizing Caesarion as the true heir of Julius Caesar. A direct attack on Octavian's legitimacy, and then divided eastern territories among their children. Alexander Helios, Cleopatra, Selene, and Ptolemy, carving a dynastic empire independent of Rome's approval. When news reached Rome, the response was immediate and furious. Octavian obtained Antony's will and read it publicly, revealing Antony's wish to be buried in Alexandria, not Rome, confirming every fear the Senate harbored. And with a masterstroke, Octavian reframed the coming conflict. He did not declare war on Antony, he declared war on Cleopatra, transforming civil war into moral crusade. Rome was not fighting a Roman general, it was defending itself against a foreign queen. And Cleopatra understood that this narrative could not be countered by logic or diplomacy. Because Rome was not afraid of defeat, it was afraid of transformation, and she had become the symbol of that fear. The Mediterranean prepared for war not as border conflict, but as ideological collision. East against West, monarchy against republican myth, destiny against memory. And Cleopatra stood at its center, knowing that victory would redefine civilization and defeat would erase her entirely. But even as Octavian mobilized fleets and senators shouted of virtue, Cleopatra did not retreat into defense. She prepared to meet Rome on its own battlefield, at sea, with a navy designed not for intimidation but dominance, believing still that power, when displayed boldly enough, could bend history itself, unaware that history would soon demand payment for every risk taken. The war between Octavian and Cleopatra was never truly about Antony or honor or even Rome itself. It was about who would define power for the next 1,000 years. And by 32 BCE, the Mediterranean had become a single tense frontier. Antony and Cleopatra assembled their forces in Greece, commanding a massive fleet, heavy armored and imposing. Egyptian warships, built like floating fortresses, designed for dominance rather than maneuver. Cleopatra herself took command of a squadron, a decision that inflamed Roman officers who already resented her influence. But Cleopatra did not command symbolically. She understood naval logistics, supply, and morale, and she believed presence itself shaped outcome. Opposing them was Octavian's admiral Agrippa, a man of discipline and innovation who fought not with spectacle but calculation. His smaller, faster ships cut supply lines, harassed ports, and isolated Antony's forces. Disease spread through Antony's camps while morale collapsed, and Cleopatra watched carefully, recognizing that this war would not be decided by size but adaptability. And when the fleets finally met near Actium in September 31st BCE, the sea itself seemed to hold its breath. The battle was chaos framed by strategy. Antony's ships lumbered forward like iron cities, while Agrippa's Liburnians swarmed them, snapping oars, igniting decks, and retreating before retaliation. Smoke, fire, and screams merged with crashing waves. And as the day stretched on, Cleopatra assessed the field not emotionally but mathematically, realizing that if the Egyptian fleet was encircled, escape would be impossible. And so she made the most controversial decision of her life, ordering her squadron to raise sails and break through a gap toward open sea. Heading for Egypt, this was not flight born of fear, but calculation born of survival. Egypt was the objective, not Greece, and a queen captured alive would mean annihilation. Antony saw her sails, and something in him broke. Whether love, panic, or recognition, history will never know. Abandoning command, he followed her in a smaller vessel, leaving his fleet leaderless and doomed. And in that moment, the war ended, not with a final clash, but with collapse. Antony's forces surrendered or defected. Legions on land pledged loyalty to Octavian, and the dream of an Eastern Empire dissolved into silence. Cleopatra and Antony escaped, but the cost was irreversible. Because Rome does not forgive hesitation, and Octavian would not miss this gift. Actium became not merely a military defeat, but a narrative victory. Octavian framed it as moral triumph, Rome saved from Eastern decadence. Antony reduced a cautionary tale Cleopatra to defeated temptress. And as the survivors retreated to Alexandria, Cleopatra understood that survival now required something beyond strategy or force. It would require control over death itself, because the war was lost, not at Actium, but in the story that followed. And Octavian would arrive, not just with armies, but with chains meant for spectacle. And Cleopatra knew she would never allow herself to be displayed as Rome's trophy. Because queens do not survive humiliation, they transcend it or vanish entirely. After Actium, Alexandria no longer felt like a capital, but like a beautifully decorated tomb. The harbor still shimmered, and the palaces still glowed in the sun, but every corridor carried the weight of approaching finality. Cleopatra and Antony returned, not as rulers, but as survivors, carrying the knowledge that the world had turned against them. Yet Cleopatra did not surrender to despair. She began preparing psychologically and strategically for the final encounter, ordering repairs to the fleet, raising troops, and sending envoys not to beg but to test Octavian's intentions, while Antony drifted between denial and fatalism, his confidence shattered by the realization that Rome no longer needed him. Cleopatra understood that Octavian would not negotiate as an equal. He wanted a spectacle, a triumph, a queen in chains led through Rome to validate his authority. And so she began shaping alternatives. She fortified a massive stone mausoleum near the temple of Isis, not as retreat, but as message, signaling to Octavian that she would control her ending. She studied poisons, testing them on condemned prisoners to determine which offered the fastest, least painful death. Not out of despair, but preparation, and at the same time she attempted diplomacy, offering Egypt's wealth in exchange for her children's survival. Because, even at the edge of extinction, Cleopatra's primary objective remained continuity. When Octavian's forces finally entered Egypt in 30 BCE, resistance collapsed rapidly. Antony attempted a final charge, but was defeated easily. And in the chaos, Cleopatra withdrew into her mausoleum, spreading a calculated false report that she had taken her own life. She knew Antony's psychology intimately, and understood that despair would push him to remove himself from the equation. And when Antony heard the news, he fell upon his sword, not dying immediately but bleeding slowly as reality overtook him, learning too late that Cleopatra still lived. He was carried to the sealed mausoleum, where Cleopatra refused to open the doors, fearing capture, instead hauling the dying Antony up through a window with ropes, her arms straining as the weight of history pulled him upward. And there Antony died in her embrace, the last Roman general to challenge Rome itself, reduced finally to a man dying in the arms of a queen. With Antony gone, Cleopatra faced Octavian alone. She was captured and brought before him, disheveled, grieving, but unbroken, attempting one last negotiation, offering submission if her children were spared. But as she watched Octavian's eyes, she recognized the absence of empathy or desire. He was not Caesar or Antony. He was colder, sharper, and focused entirely on narrative control. She understood then that survival would mean humiliation, and that Rome would never allow her to exist as symbol of resistance, only as defeated object, and Cleopatra made her final decision silently, choosing death not as escape but as defiance, denying Octavian his triumph. On August 12th, Cleopatra bathed, dressed in royal regalia, and dined as a queen one last time, sending a final message to Octavian requesting burial beside Antony. And when Roman guards entered her chamber, they found her dead upon a golden couch, her loyal attendants Iares and Charmian beside her. Whether killed by asp poison or prepared venom, history cannot say with certainty. But what mattered was not method, but meaning. Cleopatra died on her own terms, denying Rome the image it craved, transforming defeat into legend. And in that final act, she proved once more that power is not only the ability to rule, but the refusal to be reduced, even in death. Cleopatra's death did not end a life alone. It ended a civilization. With her final breath, the 3,000-year-old line of the pharaohs vanished into history. Octavian moved swiftly and without sentiment. Caesarion, the son Cleopatra had crowned King of Kings, was hunted down and executed, because Rome does not allow living symbols to challenge its myths. The boy was 17 and had ruled only in name, but his existence threatened Octavian's carefully constructed identity as Caesar's sole heir. And so Egypt lost not only its queen, but its future in a single stroke. The children she bore to Antony were spared but removed from power, paraded later in Rome as proof not of mercy but dominance. Cleopatra Selene would survive to become queen in exile, living reminder of a world Rome had crushed. Egypt itself was stripped of sovereignty entirely, no longer a client kingdom but Octavian's personal possession, its vast wealth seized, its grain redirected to feed Rome, its independence erased with bureaucratic precision. Octavian understood Egypt's value better than any Roman before him. Control Egypt, and you control Rome's stomach. And so he forbade senators from entering the province without permission, ruling it not through politics, but direct authority. Alexandria remained magnificent, but hollow, its libraries, temples, and palaces reduced to trophies of conquest. And the city that once believed itself the center of human knowledge became a warehouse for empire. In Rome, Octavian rewrote the story with surgical care. Antony was remembered as weak, corrupted, and unreliable. Cleopatra as decadent, manipulative, and dangerous, a warning disguised as villain. Poets, historians, and senators repeated the narrative until it hardened into truth, because history favors those who survive to commission it. And Augustus, as he now styled himself, needed Rome to believe that monarchy had been saved from a foreign queen rather than seized by a Roman hand. Cleopatra's intelligence, ambition, and statecraft were flattened into caricature, her alliances recast as seduction, her resistance reframed as excess, because a woman who ruled as effectively as she had could not be allowed to remain complex. Yet memory does not obey power completely. Cleopatra refused erasure. Her image survived not through Roman approval but cultural fascination. She became myth because she had been real enough to frighten empire. Playwrights, poets, and historians returned to her story again and again because it contained everything Rome tried to suppress. A woman who spoke languages, commanded fleets, negotiated with emperors, and chose death over humiliation. Cleopatra became larger in legend than Augustus ever intended. because she represented a truth Rome could not destroy. That intelligence combined with audacity can threaten even the greatest structures. Octavian emerged victorious and renamed Augustus, founding the Roman Empire. Peace imposed through dominance, order built on control. And the world entered a new age shaped by centralized authority and imperial narrative. But beneath that order lingered Cleopatra's shadow. The reminder that empire is not inevitable, and that history turns not only on armies, but on minds willing to defy expectation. Her dynasty died, but her challenge endured. And centuries later, her name would still command attention long after the marble statues of emperors had crumbled. Because Cleopatra was not remembered for losing. She was remembered for daring to stand where survival itself demanded silence. After her death, Cleopatra did not disappear. She was transformed. And this transformation was deliberate, carefully engineered, and ruthlessly effective. Augustus understood that killing a queen ended a threat, but controlling her memory ensured permanent victory. Rome did not fear Cleopatra's body, it feared her example. A woman who had ruled men, negotiated with emperors, commanded fleets, and refused humiliation. And so her story had to be rewritten until it no longer inspired resistance, but contempt. Roman poets, historians, and politicians reshaped her into something safer. She was no longer a sovereign strategist, but a seductress. No longer a ruler defending her kingdom, but a foreign enchantress, corrupting Roman virtue. Ambition was renamed lust, intelligence reduced to manipulation, and political resistance reframed as excess. Because Rome could tolerate powerful women only if they were defeated morally before being defeated militarily. Augustus allowed statues of Cleopatra to be destroyed or neglected. Her temples dismantled or repurposed, her name excluded from official memory. While Antony was remembered as tragic and weak, Cleopatra was painted as monstrous and unnatural. A woman who stepped outside her assigned role and paid the price. Roman literature turned her into a warning. Not against empire, but against female authority itself. The lesson was clear. Power in a woman must always be explained away as deception or desire. Never competence, and this narrative endured because it served Roman identity. Protecting the myth that Rome fell into empire reluctantly rather than seized it eagerly. Yet even as Rome tried to erase Cleopatra, the fascination refused to die. Greek writers preserved alternative memories. Eastern traditions remembered her as scholar and lawgiver, and the very intensity of Rome's hatred ensured her survival in imagination. Because villains crafted to carefully invite curiosity. Centuries later, medieval scholars rediscovered her story through fragments colored by propaganda, yet still powerful enough to inspire reinterpretation. Renaissance thinkers saw in Cleopatra not merely excess, but intellect and theatrical authority. Shakespeare transformed her into a figure of tragic grandeur, complex, emotional, and commanding. Not reduced but enlarged, and with each retelling, Cleopatra slipped further from Roman control. Modern historians slowly dismantled the Augustan narrative, uncovering the administrative reforms, economic stability, and diplomatic brilliance of her reign, revealing a polyglot ruler fluent in politics, science, and culture, a naval commander who understood logistics and morale, a queen who ruled Egypt effectively for 2 decades in an era that devoured weaker leaders in months. And as evidence accumulated, the caricature collapsed. Cleopatra emerged not as anomaly, but inevitability. The product of an education unmatched, and a world that demanded brutality masked by elegance. Cleopatra's greatest victory may not have been political, but symbolic. Rome conquered her land, but never fully conquered her meaning. She became a mirror reflecting each age's fears and desires. To Rome she was chaos, to Renaissance Europe romance, to modern audiences resistance and intellect. And this adaptability ensured immortality, because stories that survive are those flexible enough to remain dangerous. Cleopatra endured because she refused simplicity. She could not be flattened completely. And in that refusal, she achieved what empire could not grant or deny. A permanent place in human memory, not as Rome's defeated enemy, but as its most haunting challenge. For centuries, Cleopatra was reduced to a face, a body, a temptation, because empires prefer simple stories over uncomfortable truths. But when stripped of Roman propaganda and romantic distortion, what remains is one of the most deliberate political minds of the ancient world. Cleopatra ruled not through inheritance alone, but through constant calculation, adapting faster than the men around her. She inherited a bankrupt, unstable Egypt, surrounded by Roman ambition, and transformed it into a functioning power, capable of funding legions, fleets, and prolonged war. She restructured taxation, stabilized grain supply, restored temple economies, and ensured Egypt remained indispensable to Rome rather than disposable, because Cleopatra understood leverage better than loyalty. Egypt's value was not affection, but necessity. Her mastery of language was not scholarly vanity, but diplomatic weaponry. She spoke directly to envoys, kings, priests, merchants, and soldiers, without translators controlling tone, nuance, and intent, something no Ptolemy before her had attempted. This allowed her to bypass intermediaries who often distort power. Cleopatra negotiated personally because she understood that authority weakens when filtered. She presented herself as pharaoh to Egyptians, as Hellenistic monarch to Greeks, and as equal sovereign to Romans, shifting identity fluidly without losing control of narrative. This was not confusion, but precision. A ruler who understood that legitimacy is contextual, not fixed. Militarily, Cleopatra has often been dismissed, yet she commanded the largest fleet in the Eastern Mediterranean at her peak, personally financed Roman legions, and understood naval warfare, logistics, supply, morale, and retreat. Her decision at Actium is often portrayed as cowardice, but strategically it preserved Egypt as long as possible. Had she been captured alive, the war would have ended not in defeat, but humiliation and erasure. Cleopatra chose survival over spectacle until survival no longer served purpose. And when defeat became inevitable, she denied Rome its symbolic victory, because power to her was never only the ability to rule, but the authority to decide how one exits history. Cleopatra also understood time better than her enemies. She knew Rome's strength lay in narrative control, and she attempted to counter it by establishing Caesarion as legitimate air forcing Rome to confront its own contradictions. Octavian did not defeat her argument, he erased it by killing the evidence. And even then he failed completely, because the question Cleopatra raised never disappeared: whether power belongs to those who seize it or those who justify it afterward. In the end, Cleopatra was not defeated by incompetence or seduction or excess, but by scale. Rome was larger, more ruthless, and willing to destroy its own myths to survive. Yet Cleopatra forced Rome to reveal itself fully, to abandon the illusion of republic and embrace empire openly, and in that sense she did not lose. She accelerated history, exposing the truth beneath Roman virtue. She stood at the threshold between worlds, ancient and imperial, feminine and masculine, inherited and constructed, and refused to retreat quietly. Cleopatra remains unsettling because she proves that intelligence, ambition, and authority can exist simultaneously in a woman without apology. And that truth remains threatening even now. Cleopatra lived at the fault line of history where one age collapsed and another rose fully armed. She was not merely the last pharaoh, but the final sovereign of the ancient Mediterranean order, a world where kings ruled by divine-sanctioned cities, defined culture and power flowed through lineage, ritual, and tradition. And against this world stood Rome, a new force that rejected divine kingship publicly while practicing it privately, replacing sacred authority with military bureaucracy and narrative control. Cleopatra understood this transformation earlier than most. She saw that Rome was not another rival kingdom, but an extinction-level system that absorbed identities erased, sovereignty and standardized power, and she chose not to submit quietly to that process. Egypt under Cleopatra represented continuity. Temples older than Rome itself, priests guarding rituals that connected people to cosmic order, rulers embodying land and fertility. And Cleopatra positioned herself deliberately as guardian of that continuity, presenting herself as Isis, not as vanity but as legitimacy. Because in Egypt the ruler was not administrator but living symbol. Rome could not understand this without fearing it, because symbolism creates loyalty deeper than law. And Cleopatra's rule threatened Rome's project of reducing power to obedience alone. Her confrontation with Rome was therefore inevitable, not personal. Caesar, Antony, and Octavian were not just men, but expressions of a system that could not tolerate alternative centers of meaning. Cleopatra's refusal to become a silent client queen was interpreted as rebellion because autonomy itself was rebellion. And when she chose death over capture, she was not escaping defeat, but rejecting Rome's authority to define her end. She denied empire, the ritual of domination, the parade, the chains, the rewritten ending, and in doing so, she preserved something Rome could not conquer. Agency. With her death, the ancient world receded permanently. Egypt became a province, gods became curiosities' kings, became administrators, and power became abstract, centralized, and bureaucratic. Augustus ruled not as divine being, but as first citizen, while holding absolute authority. A contradiction Cleopatra had exposed too clearly, and Rome learned from her example. Future emperors would ensure no rival sovereign ever again commanded myth and material simultaneously. Cleopatra's era ended, but its questions did not. She asked whether power must erase difference to survive, whether legitimacy comes from force or belief, and whether history belongs to victors or resistors. Rome answered with empire, but the unease remained, because Cleopatra stood as proof that another model once existed, and that its destruction required not just conquest, but narrative violence. And that knowledge lingers, making her not a relic of the past, but a challenge carried forward, reminding every empire that dominance is never complete, and that the past resists being silenced forever. Cleopatra did not survive in memory because she was beautiful or tragic or scandalous. She survived because history failed to contain her. Every empire attempts to simplify its enemies into warnings, and Cleopatra was no exception. Rome tried to compress her into a lesson about excess foreignness and feminine danger, but the compression never held, because her life resisted reduction at every turn. She ruled longer than most Roman generals survived politics. She negotiated with the most powerful men of her age as an equal. She governed a complex economy, stabilized a fractured kingdom, and held Egypt together while Rome devoured itself. And these facts refused to disappear, no matter how aggressively they were buried. Each era reshaped Cleopatra according to its own anxieties. Medieval writers turned her into a moral fable. Renaissance artists turned her into romance. Imperial Europe turned her into exotic spectacle. and modern culture oscillated between glamour and stereotype. But beneath every retelling, the same core persisted. A woman who refused passivity in a world structured to erase female authority. Cleopatra unsettles because she contradicts expectation. She was neither saint nor victim nor accessory. She was decision-maker, architect, and executor of policy. And that makes her dangerous to simplistic narratives. What history struggled with most was not Cleopatra's defeat, but her autonomy. She chose alliances, chose war, chose motherhood, chose death. And in doing so, she denied others the power to define her trajectory. Even Octavian could not fully claim victory because the ending did not belong to him. Cleopatra controlled the final image, and that control echoed forward. Because empires depend not only on winning wars, but on owning conclusions. And Cleopatra refused to grant that ownership. In this sense, Cleopatra was not merely the last pharaoh, but the last ruler of a world where sovereignty was personal, embodied, and symbolic. After her power became faceless, institutional, and distant, authority moved from living figures to abstract systems, and something human was lost in the transition. Cleopatra's story remains compelling because it captures that moment of loss, the shift from mythic rule to administrative empire, from queens to emperors, from identity to efficiency. She stands therefore not only as historical figure, but as boundary marker, the end of one way of organizing reality and the beginning of another. And that is why she cannot be dismissed or domesticated fully. Cleopatra exists where history fractures, where gender, power, empire, and memory collide, and she remains there still, unresolved, unsettling, and alive in imagination. Because some figures are not meant to be understood comfortably. They are meant to be returned to again and again as reminders that the world we inherited was not inevitable, and that there were other paths, briefly illuminated by a queen who refused to vanish quietly.
What Rome feared most about Cleopatra was never her armies or her alliances, but her refusal to be owned, because even in defeat she denied the empire its most sacred ritual, humiliation. Octavian needed her alive not for mercy but for theater. A queen dragged in chains through Roman streets would seal his authority more completely than any battle. And Cleopatra understood this with perfect clarity. She saw how Rome consumed symbols, how it fed on spectacle, how it converted enemies into warnings, and she chose to break that mechanism entirely. Her final days were not spent in panic, but in control. She organized her affairs, secured her children's immediate safety where possible, and prepared her death with the same deliberation she had applied to rule, testing poisons not as despair, but as strategy, selecting an ending that would deny Rome narrative dominance. Because to Cleopatra, power was never just command over others, but sovereignty over oneself. Her death was therefore not escape, but confrontation, a final refusal to be rewritten by men who believed history belonged to them by right of survival. Octavian arrived too late to claim her body, and too late to shape her ending. And in that moment, Rome lost something it rarely surrendered: control over meaning. Cleopatra's suicide was an act Rome could not punish retroactively, and could not fully explain away. It disrupted the triumph it had planned, and forced Augustus to rule without the visual proof of conquest he desired. A queen dead by her own decision undermined the empire's claim of total dominance, because it proved there were limits even Rome could not cross. This choice terrified Rome more than resistance ever had, because rebellion can be crushed, but autonomy cannot be paraded. Cleopatra denied empire the pleasure of her submission, and in doing so preserved her authority beyond death. She exited history on her own terms and forced Rome to respond defensively through propaganda rather than celebration. Her final act exposed the fragility beneath imperial confidence, revealing that even the greatest system depended on cooperation from its enemies to complete the story, and Cleopatra refused to cooperate. In that refusal, she achieved a strange victory, not military or political, but existential. She transformed loss into authorship and defeat into legacy. And centuries later, it is not Octavian's triumph that unsettles memory, but Cleopatra's decision, because power that cannot command obedience over death itself is incomplete, and Rome learned this lesson silently, tightening control afterward, ensuring that no rival sovereign would ever again be allowed to choose their own ending. Cleopatra's final choice became a warning not to subjects, but to emperors, proof that absolute power is an illusion, and that the most dangerous act is not rebellion, but refusal. With Cleopatra's death, Rome believed it had closed the final chapter of resistance and secured the future without challenge. Yet history does not obey empires as cleanly as armies do. Augustus ruled longer than any Roman before him and reshaped the Mediterranean into a unified imperial system. But even as his statues multiplied and his laws hardened, Cleopatra's shadow persisted, because she represented something empire could not reproduce, a ruler whose authority was personal, intellectual, and symbolic rather than bureaucratic. Egypt became Rome's possession, its grain fed Roman crowds, its wealth fueled Roman stability, yet its memory remained haunted by the woman who had ruled it as sovereign rather than resource. Cleopatra's name continued to circulate, not because Rome preserved it, but because it could not silence it, whispered through Greek histories, Eastern traditions, and later Roman anxieties, transforming gradually from enemy into enigma. As centuries passed, Cleopatra became a mirror rather than a monument. Each age looked into her story and found its own questions reflected back: power and gender, legitimacy and ambition, resistance and choice. Medieval chroniclers moralized her, Renaissance thinkers dramatized her, Enlightenment scholars debated her, and modern historians dismantled the myths layered over her by Augustan propaganda, revealing a ruler of rare capability whose reign had been deliberately distorted to protect imperial narrative. Cleopatra emerged not as anomaly, but as warning, proof that history is shaped as much by suppression as by survival. Her true legacy was not romance, tragedy, or spectacle, but disruption. She forced Rome to abandon the illusion of republic and reveal itself as empire. She exposed the limits of military dominance by asserting control over narrative and death itself, and she demonstrated that intelligence, strategy, and authority were not bound to gender even in the ancient world. Cleopatra's refusal to vanish quietly ensured that empire could never fully claim moral victory, because she remained unresolved, too complex to flatten, too deliberate to dismiss. Today, Cleopatra endures not because she lost, but because she resisted at a scale few could. She stands at the boundary between worlds, ancient and imperial, mythic and administrative, personal and institutional, and that boundary remains relevant because the questions she raised never disappeared: who decides legitimacy, who controls memory, and whether power belongs to those who conquer or those who refuse to submit. Cleopatra answered not with armies, but with choice, and that answer continues to unsettle every system that claims permanence. Empires rise believing themselves inevitable and fall believing the same lie. Cleopatra understood this earlier than most and acted accordingly. Her dynasty ended, but her defiance did not. She remains not a footnote, but a challenge carried forward through time, reminding the world that history is never only written by victors, it is also shaped by those who deny them the ending they desire. And in that refusal, Cleopatra achieved the only victory empire could never reverse: remembrance on her own terms.